I had signed 1,000 orders without hesitation. Treaties that ended wars, exile decrees for wolves who had killed without cause, execution warrants for the worst of them, the ones who had looked at me across a blood-soaked clearing and smiled. My hand had never stopped moving. My wolf had never flinched. The order on my desk that morning was a single page, a woman's name at the top, an exile decree, the council's seal already pressed into the wax at the bottom, waiting only for mine. I had not signed it. I had been sitting in my council chamber for the better part of an hour, which was 400 years longer than any document had ever kept me waiting, and I could not explain why my hand would not move. I told myself it was the irregularity of the proceedings. Lord Varen had convened the council vote without my presence, a technical violation of Dravenmoor's charter that I had chosen to overlook a dozen times when the matter was small. This was not small. An exile decree required the Alpha King's signature, and the Alpha King had not been in the room. That was reason enough to pause. I told myself that. My wolf curled at the foot of my chair, lifted its massive gray head and looked at me. I set the quill down. She had come to Dravenmoor 11 months ago in the early grip of the cold season, when the herb stores were low, and the pack's previous herbalist had died of the same lung fever that had swept through the lower wards. I had not hired her. My steward had, on the strength of a letter of recommendation from a healer in the Southern Territories, and a list of remedies that my steward said was the most thorough he had seen in 30 years of managing this keep. I remembered signing her appointment papers the way I remembered signing most administrative work, without looking up. Her name was Fen, no family name given, which was not unusual for a woman of the traveling healer class, and no pack affiliation, which was. The appointment document listed her standing as ungrouped, a polite word for a wolf who had been born outside any pack's territory and registered to none. She had no bloodline on record, no former alpha's seal of endorsement. She had her letter, her remedy list, and apparently a quiet confidence in her own competence that my steward had found reassuring. She moved into the herbalist's quarters at the far end of the east wing and began her work. Within a fortnight, the lung fever had broken in the lower wards. Within a month, 3 wolves who had been carrying a joint ailment for years were moving without pain. The pack noticed. I did not particularly, because I did not make a habit of monitoring the herbalist's wing with any precision. I had a kingdom to run. My wolf noticed, though. That was the first strange thing, and I should have paid attention because my wolf did not notice people. It was not cold exactly, not the kind of cold that kept other alpha's beasts from forming attachments or responding to the pack. It was simply indifferent. It had been indifferent for a very long time. 4 centuries of solitary rule will do that to a wolf. The longing stops feeling like longing and begins to feel like weather, something you simply live inside. The pack wolves liked it well enough. It ran with them in the deep forest twice a moon, which satisfied the need for connection without the complication of wanting more. It had never, in 400 years, pressed its nose against any door and waited. The first time I found it sitting outside the herbalist's quarters, I assumed it had followed a scent, a wounded pack wolf that had come for treatment, or a batch of remedies being prepared with something that smelled like prey. I collected it without comment and thought no more about it. The second time, I stood in the corridor for a longer moment and looked at the closed door. There was no sound from within, no wounded wolf inside that I could detect. The wolf sat with its chin nearly touching the wood and its great tail moving slowly once across the stone floor. I had not seen it move its tail in a very long time. I told myself it was the herbs. Some combination of ingredients she was working with that appealed to the wolf's nose. I brought it back to my quarters. The next morning it was at her door again before I was awake. I began, in spite of myself, to notice other things. She worked in the herb garden at dawn, before anyone else was up, in a heavy wool cloak that had been mended at the hem more than once. She moved between the rows with a small basket over one arm and the focused quiet of a woman who was very comfortable being alone. She talked to herself sometimes, or perhaps to the plants. Low murmurs I couldn't quite catch from the window above, though I found myself standing there more than once without a clear reason for it. She was not beautiful in the way the pack understood beauty. She was not the high-blooded she-wolves my council periodically presented to me as suitable matches, tall women with silver pack marks and careful poise, and the particular quality of looking as though they had been bred specifically to stand beside an alpha king, and make it look natural. Fen was shorter than most, with a kind of quiet in her face that made her easy to overlook in a crowd, and she had a habit of going still when she was thinking that made some of the court staff mistake her for inattentive. She was not inattentive. I had learned that quickly in the handful of times our paths crossed in the keep's corridors. She noticed everything. She just didn't perform the noticing, which was, I had come to understand, a quality I had not encountered very often in my 4 centuries of court life, where performance was practically a second language. She bowed correctly when she saw me. Not the elaborate, held-too-long bow of someone trying to be seen bowing, but the clean, adequate inclination of a woman who respected the rank without being afraid of the man. Then she looked up. She had warm, brown eyes that did not skitter away the moment they met mine, which was rarer than it had any right to be. "My lord," she would say, just that. And then she would continue on her way because she had work to do, and she assumed correctly that I did too. I noticed that I looked forward to the corridor, encounters more than was reasonable. I did not examine that too closely. There was always something else to attend to. Lord Varon noticed too, but he noticed different things. Varon held the largest pack seat on my council. He was 4th-generation Dravenmore nobility, which he wore the way some men wear armor, always, and slightly too heavily. His daughter, Setha, had been positioned at court for 2 seasons now as a potential consort candidate, and Varon had managed the campaign with the kind of careful, patient maneuvering that I found mildly distasteful and largely harmless. There were always lords angling their daughters into the Alpha King's sight. I ignored it in an established, routine way. What I did not anticipate was his turning that maneuvering toward Fen. He began with comments in council, offhand and easily ignored at first. The herbalist's qualifications were unusual for a court appointment, he thought. Had my steward verified the recommendation letter? The ungrouped designation was, of course, legitimate by the charter's letter, but it was worth noting that the East Wing position had traditionally been held by a wolf with clear pack affiliation. It was a matter of the keep's integrity. The stores, had anyone checked the stores recently? He said it pleasantly. He always said things pleasantly. I told him the remedies spoke for themselves and moved on to other business. He moved on too, to other council members, to other ears, to the slower and more patient work of building a case that could be brought back to me when I was less likely to dismiss it in a single sentence. I found this out later. At the time, I noticed only that Varon was spending more time in the East Wing corridor than a pack lord had any particular reason to spend, and that 2 of the kitchen staff who regularly exchanged words with Fen had gone oddly quiet in her presence. I noticed, and I filed it, and I told myself it was not my business to manage the social currents of my own court like a hen counting chicks. I was an Alpha King. I had larger concerns. My wolf stood at Fen's door 3 mornings out of 5, and would not be moved until she opened it. The visiting lord was named Edris. He was from the Western Coast Territories, come to Dravenmore to negotiate a grain road treaty, and he was perfectly fine in every way that I found inexplicably grating. He was polite. He was well-spoken. He paid his respects in council with neither too much deference nor too little, which was the correct register, and I had no legitimate complaint about him. On his 3rd day in the keep, he came across Fen in the corridor near the Great Hall, where she was carrying a case of dried preparations to the infirmary. He stopped. He looked at her properly, not the look of a lord cataloging a servant, but the look of a man encountering someone who had surprised him pleasantly. He said something I couldn't hear from where I stood at the far end of the passage, and she said something back, and he smiled, and she did too, and the thing that happened in my chest at that moment was not anything I had a name for. I had won by the time I reached my council chamber. I was aware that what I had felt watching Lord Edris smile at my herbalist was a species of fury that had no professional justification whatsoever. I was also aware, with a clarity that was slightly uncomfortable, that the fury was not about Edris. It was not even really about the smile. It was about the fact that she had returned it, that she stood in the corridor with her case of dried preparations and looked at a man who had noticed her, properly noticed her, and her warm brown eyes had lit in the way they didn't usually light when she passed me in the corridor and said, "My lord," and continued on her way. I stood in my council chamber and thought about that for several minutes. Then I went to the herb garden at a time I had no reason to go there, under the pretext of reviewing the eastern grounds, and found her there alone in the gray afternoon light, crouched over a low bed of winter herbs with a small brush. and my wolf pressed against my leg and then walked ahead of me and sat down directly beside her. She looked up, she looked at the wolf, she looked at me. "My lord," she said, as she always did. But this time she stayed crouched, which meant she was at the wolf's level, and the wolf turned its great head and pressed its nose against her shoulder, and she went still for a moment in the way she went still when she was thinking, and then she set her brush down very carefully and raised her hand and let the wolf decide. It pushed into her hand like a thing starved for something it had forgotten the name of. I had nothing to say. I stood in my own herb garden in the cold afternoon like a man who had arrived somewhere he didn't know he was going, and looked at my 400-year-old wolf leaning into this woman's hand with its eyes closed. And I understood, in the way you understand something that has been true for a while before you catch up to it, exactly what was happening. I said nothing that afternoon. I collected my wolf. Eventually, it took longer than I would like to admit, and I walked back to the keep, and I told myself I would think about this sensibly. That I was the Alpha King of Dravenmore. That there was a proper way to proceed with this sort of revelation, a set of steps my council expected, a formal presentation process, a bloodline verification, an announcement protocol. I told myself all of that very sensibly. Then I went to 3 different windows that had a view of the herb garden over the next 2 days, and stood there at lengths I would not have admitted to anyone. Varen moved faster than I expected. I learned the specifics afterward. At the time, what reached me was this. My steward arrived at my chamber door on a gray morning in the deep of winter, and told me, with the particular careful neutrality of a man delivering news he'd rather not carry, that the council had convened an emergency session while I was in the northern watchtower for the quarterly inspection, and that by the session's end, 3 council members had voted to censure the court herbalist pending an investigation into missing apothecary stores. And Lord Varen had produced what he described as a supply record showing a pattern of shortfalls coinciding exactly with Fenn's appointment. And that the council, exercising the emergency provision that allowed a majority vote to issue a temporary exile decree pending the Alpha King's signature, had done so. My steward placed the document on my desk. I looked at it. The thing I felt was cold and very specific. It was not surprise, exactly. It was the recognition of a move I had not moved quickly enough to block, on a board I had not been watching closely enough. "Who called the session?" I asked. "Lord Varen, my lord, on the grounds of financial irregularity requiring urgent review." "And who has informed the herbalist?" A pause. "The chamberlain was sent to the East Wing an hour ago, my lord." I picked up the document. I read it. The language was formal and precise and gave Fenn 3 days to remove herself from the keep's grounds. I set it on the desk without signing it. "Bring me the original supply records," I said. "Every entry from the last 12 months, not the copies." My steward went. I sat at my desk, and my wolf sat beside it, and I thought about a woman crouching in a winter herb garden with a small brush, going still before she raised her hand, and the look in her eyes when the wolf pressed into her palm, not triumph, not satisfaction, just something quiet and wondering and a little careful, as though she was not quite sure she was allowed to be glad. I thought about 3 days. I went to the East Wing that evening. I was aware this was not the thing an Alpha King did, not in the middle of a council dispute, not before an investigation's findings were in, not before the document on his desk was formally addressed one way or another. An Alpha King managed such matters through proper channels and presented conclusions in the appropriate venue. I was aware of all of this. My wolf went down the east corridor, and I followed it. The herbalist's quarters were at the far end, a set of 3 modest rooms that smelled of dried lavender and something warmer underneath, resin or cedar or both. The door was open. I could see from the corridor that a travel case had been brought out and set on the floor beside the small table, though nothing had been packed into it yet. She was standing at the window with her back to the door. She didn't move when the wolf entered. She must have heard its step on the stone, must have known what followed, and she didn't turn around immediately, which gave me the odd and unwelcome impression that she was composing herself before she did. When she turned, she was composed. Her face was the face she usually wore in the corridor, the quiet one, the adequate bow and the warm eyes and the steady look. But she was paler than usual, and there was a set to her mouth that told me she had already done whatever internal work the situation required and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it. "My lord," she said. My wolf went to her. It sat at her feet and looked up at her and made no move to leave. "You haven't begun packing," I said. "I was about to," she said. "I thought I had 3 days." "You do," I paused. "I haven't signed it." Something moved in her face, not relief exactly, more like the thing you feel when you've prepared for a fall and then the floor holds. "I see," she said carefully. "I want to understand what Varen's evidence consists of," I said. "Before any document is signed in my kingdom, I want to see the original records and the copies side by side, and I want to know who handled them between the stores and the council chamber." She looked at me for a moment, "And if the records say what Lord Varen says they say, then they will say it in my presence with both records visible." I held her gaze. "Is there anything you want to tell me about the stores?" Her chin came up, not defiance, not the aggressive kind, the kind that comes from knowing your own truth clearly. "I have taken nothing from this keep that was not allocated to my work," she said. "Every preparation I have made, every remedy distributed, every ingredient used is logged in the herbalist's ledger in my own hand. It is on the shelf above my work table, and it has been there since my first week." I looked at the shelf. The ledger was there. "I'll want that as well," I said. She crossed the room, took it down, and held it out. She didn't let go of it immediately when I reached for it, not deliberately, I thought, only because her hands were steadier than the rest of her, and the steadiness took a moment to transfer. When I had it, I stood in her doorway with the ledger and looked at the travel case on the floor. "Don't pack," I said. I went back down the corridor. My wolf stayed where it was for a long moment before it followed me. I could hear it, the soft drag of its step, reluctant, the way a creature feels when it is leaving something it doesn't want to leave. I understood that entirely. The original supply records arrived on my desk by midnight. I read them beside the council copy that Varen had submitted as evidence, and I had the particular experience of watching a forgery reveal itself at its own pace. It was not crude work. Whoever had altered the records had taken care to match the handwriting of the original supply clerk, had made the shortfalls appear gradually over several months rather than all at once, and had chosen amounts small enough to be plausibly overlooked rather than large enough to be obviously staged. What they had not accounted for was that the original supply ledger used a particular grade of iron gall ink that darkened differently from the substitute the forger had used to add lines. Under adequate lamplight, with the 2 documents side by side, the discrepancy was visible on 12 of the 19 altered entries. It would not have been obvious to someone reading one document in isolation. Put side by side with attention, it was unambiguous. I spent another hour with Fenn's Herbalist ledger. It was, as she had said, meticulous, every preparation dated and itemized, every ingredient cross-referenced to the store allocation. Nothing missing, nothing unexplained. The record of a woman who kept careful accounts not because someone was watching, but because she simply did. I found near the back of the ledger an entry from 3 weeks into her appointment. It read in small, precise handwriting, "Gray Wolf Alpha Large. Came to the garden gate this morning and watched while I worked. Did not approach. Eyes amber. Left after approximately 1 hour. Below it on the next line she had written, came again the following morning. I believe he will come again." Below that, 5 days later, he came again. I think he is looking for something. I sat with that entry for a long time. The morning I had been putting off arrived sooner than felt reasonable. The council reconvened at my summons, all 7 lords, Varen among them, in his customary seat near the window where the light fell most favorably on a man who liked to be read as reasonable. I had the original supply records and the council copies set out on the table in 2 columns before I entered. My steward had placed them according to my instructions without comment. I set Fenn's Herbalist ledger beside them. "The evidence submitted by Lord Varen," I said without sitting, "shows a shortfall pattern in the apothecary stores over 11 months. The council voted on this evidence without my presence." I did not make that sound like the reproach it was. I simply let it sit. "I have reviewed the original supply records alongside the copies Lord Varen presented to the council." I let the silence run for a moment. Varen's face was composed. He was good at composed. I had always given him that. "The copies are not identical to the originals," I said. "On 12 entries across the document, the ink composition differs." The additions were made after the original records were sealed. I turned to my steward. Bring in the apothecary clerk. The clerk, a young wolf, third season, who had the look of someone who had not slept in 3 days, came in with the walk of a man deciding, in real time, whether the thing he was about to say would cost him more than the thing he had been told to keep silent about. I had, the evening before, told him through my steward that his Alpha King was interested only in the truth, that he was not in trouble for what had been done to the records while they were in his temporary custody, and that the man who had asked him to hand them over briefly to a courier he did not recognize was the man in trouble. He said Varen's name. He said it clearly, in front of the assembled council, in the voice of someone who has decided the floor will hold. Varen did not move. Then he moved, but it was too late, the kind of shift that is really a recalculation, the moment when a man stops performing composure and starts performing innocence instead, which is a different and more recognizable thing. "This is," Varen began. "Enough," I said. He stopped. I looked at each lord in turn. The exile decree issued by this council was based on falsified evidence produced by a lord who had material interest in the herbalist's removal. The decree is void. I picked up the unsigned document from the table in front of me where my steward had placed it. I tore it down the center twice and set the pieces back on the table. "Lord Varen will be suspended from this council pending a full inquiry which I will conduct personally. His pack seat is held in abeyance." I turned to Varen directly. "You will remain in Dravenmoor until the inquiry is complete. Do you understand?" He understood. He said so because there was nothing else to say. The council chamber was very quiet. "Dismissed," I said, "all of you." They filed out, Varen last with 2 of my household guard falling into step behind him as I had arranged. The door closed. I stood in an empty council chamber with a torn exile decree and a 400-year-old wolf that had come in quietly at some point and was now sitting beside my chair with its chin resting on the armrest. I had done the right thing, unambiguously and completely. I had identified the forgery, named the forger, voided the decree, and stripped Varen of his council seat pending proper process. All correct, all necessary. And none of it had yet addressed the single fact that had been sitting at the center of my attention for weeks, which was that I was in love with my herbalist. I was aware this was, by any reasonable standard, a significant development in my 400 years of careful, solitary, well-managed rule. I was also aware that the proper sequence now was to send for her, inform her that the decree was voided, confirm that her position in the keep was secure, and give her time and space to recover from what had been a significant upheaval. The formal steps, if I intended to take formal steps, came after that, after she had settled. After I had presented the matter through appropriate channels, as the Alpha King of Dravenmoor presenting an intention regarding his mate, which required a council meeting and a formal acknowledgement, and my wolf stood up, went to the door, and looked back at me. I followed it. The courtyard outside the east wing was not a space I had designed for significant moments. It was a practical square of stone between the herb garden wall and the kitchen stores, used primarily for moving crates and the occasional airing of the infirmary linens. There was a bench against the eastern wall that the herbalist staff used during their midday rest. It was not a throne room. Fen was sitting on the bench. She had her cloak on and a small case beside her, not the large travel case I had seen in her room, but the small one she used for garden work. She was not packing it. She was sitting with it beside her and her hands in her lap, and she had the look of someone waiting to find out whether the floor was going to hold. She stood when she saw me. "My lord," she said, and then a beat later with the kind of careful hope that costs something to show, "The decree is voided," I said. "Varen's evidence was forged. He has been suspended from the council." The breath she let out was not dramatic. It was the breath of a woman who had been holding herself together carefully for 2 days and could now put that effort down. She set it down quietly, which was entirely in keeping with everything else she did. "I see," she said, and then, "Thank you, my lord." My wolf walked past me. It crossed the courtyard stones in no particular hurry, and it sat down directly at her feet, and it turned its head to look at her, and its great gray tail swept across the stone once, twice, in the old slow way it had, the way I had not seen in more years than I could easily count. It pressed its nose against her hand. Then it leaned the full weight of its large head against her leg and closed its eyes. She looked down at it, then she looked up at me. I was aware I was standing in my own courtyard with no speech prepared, which had not happened in a very long time. The Alpha King of Dravenmoor prepared speeches. He had procedures. He had appropriate timing and appropriate channels, and 4 centuries of practice at managing significant matters with the correct degree of distance and formality. He has done this since the beginning, I said, from the first week you arrived. She was quiet. I thought it was the herbs, I said, at first. And then, she asked. It was a small question. She asked it in the same voice she used for everything, quiet, not pressing, with the quality of genuine interest and no performance around it. I crossed the courtyard. I stopped a pace from her, because I was aware I had no right to close the distance without giving her the information she would need to make sense of it, and the information was this. My wolf has not chosen anyone in 400 years, I said. I have not chosen anyone in 400 years, and I told myself for 11 months that this was manageable, that I was simply paying attention to a competent member of my keep staff, and there was nothing unusual about it. I paused. The morning Varen's decree arrived on my desk. I understood that I had been lying to myself for 11 months. She was very still. I should have moved sooner, I said. I should have looked at what my wolf was showing me and understood it for what it was, and I did not, and you spent 2 days believing you were going to be exiled from this place because I was slow. I felt the weight of that. That is on me. You voided the decree, she said. After you had already packed a case. She looked down at the small case beside her. That's the garden case, she said. I brought it out because I thought if the decree stood I would want to take cuttings from a few of the herbs I had grown from seed. They wouldn't survive long in transit, but I thought. She stopped. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one wry and tired. I didn't pack the travel case. I thought I should, but I kept finding reasons to do other things instead. I looked at her. Why? She was quiet for a moment. I think I was waiting, she said, to find out whether the floor was going to hold. The wolf's tail swept across the stones again. It holds, I said. She looked up at me. The warm brown eyes, direct and unperforming, and the careful hope still in them. And underneath it something she had been keeping low and steady for a long time that I recognized, because I had been keeping the same thing low and steady for the same amount of time. And we had both apparently been watching each other from opposite ends of corridors and garden paths, and not saying so. I don't have a bloodline, she said. I'm not registered to any pack. I have no rank and no. I know what you have, I said. She stopped. I have read your ledger, I said. Every page, including the entry from your 3rd week, where you noted a gray wolf that came to watch you work and wrote that you thought he was looking for something. The color that moved into her face was quiet and real. He was, I said. I unclasped the iron clasp at my throat, the one that held my outer cloak, the one bearing the wolf mark of Dravenmoor that every Alpha King of this territory had worn when they claimed something that mattered. And I did not make a ceremony of it. I just stepped forward and set it around her shoulders. The wolf at her feet lifted its head and looked between us, and its tail moved in the slow, deliberate sweep of a creature that has been waiting for something to happen, and is now watching it happen exactly as it knew it would. Fen, I said, her name plain, the first time I had said it aloud in her hearing. You are my fated mate. My wolf knew it before I admitted what I was looking at. I am asking if you will stay. She held very still under the weight of the cloak. Then she looked down at the wolf and back up at me, and the careful hope in her face had become something else. Not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of a thing earned after scorn. Just the simple, clear, uncomplicated warmth of a woman who had been quietly willing to hope for something and had been given a reason to. I'll stay, she said. There were steps after that. There are always steps when you are the Alpha King of a pack kingdom and you have just claimed a mate in a courtyard without the appropriate advance announcements. I did not mind the steps. I had 400 years of steps behind me. I was familiar with the process. What I was not familiar with, what I had no procedure for and found I did not want one for, was the particular experience of walking back through my own keep beside a woman who had, apparently, been quietly present in my life for 11 months, and who I was only now permitted to walk beside openly. and noticing that it felt less like a new thing than like the end of pretending that a thing didn't exist. My steward met us at the entrance to the main hall and had, bless him, the good sense to look at the cloak on her shoulders and make no expression whatsoever except the small. Contained one of a man who has been managing this keep for 60 years and is constitutionally resistant to being surprised by anything. "My lord," he said. "My lady," he said, which was fast work. "Arrange for the council's return," I said, "in 1 hour." He went. She looked at me sideways as we walked. "Is there a procedure?" she asked. "There is always a procedure," I said. "Will it be complicated?" "Not particularly," I said. "I'm the Alpha King, the procedures bend." The small sound she made at that was, I realized after a moment, a very quiet laugh, controlled, brief, the kind she had probably been suppressing in the East Wing corridor for months when we passed each other, and she said, "My lord," and continued on her way. It was the first time I had heard it. It was a remarkably good sound. The council reconvened in the Great Hall, which was the formal venue for an Alpha King's announcement, with the wolf standards hanging from the iron rafters and the amber candles burning in the chandelier above the long table. The lords stood as I entered. My wolf came with me. Fen walked at my right. She had not changed her dress, which was the plain herbalist's gray she wore every day under my cloak. I had thought to suggest she might want to present herself differently, and then reconsidered, because her plain gray dress and her once-mended cloak hem and her quiet face that didn't perform anything were precisely who she was, and I was not going to begin this by implying she should be other than who she was. The lords looked at the cloak on her shoulders, and at the wolf walking beside her, and they drew the obvious conclusion before I said a word, because lords in a fated mate kingdom are not slow at reading those particular signs. I told them clearly, the exile decree was void, the evidence was forged, and Lord Varen's actions had been confirmed as deliberate and dishonest. I told them that Fen, court herbalist of Dravenmore, was my fated mate, recognized by my wolf and by me, and that the formal presentation of her as my Luna would proceed according to charter protocol over the following month, that they were to acknowledge her as such from this moment. The lords acknowledged it. Some with more visible enthusiasm than others. Lord Edris of the Western Territories, I noticed, gave a nod that had a particular quality of unsurprised warmth to it, as though this outcome seemed to him entirely reasonable, and I found I had no remaining objection to the man. The others followed protocol, because that was what protocol was for. Afterward, in the corridor outside the Great Hall, one of the younger lords, barely 2 decades in his seat, still young enough to say things without calculating them first, stopped me and said quietly, "We wondered, my lord, when your wolf started staying outside her quarters, we wondered if you knew." "I was slow," I said. He nodded wisely and continued on. The formal proceedings took their month, as they always do. There were the charter acknowledgments, the bloodline documentation, which, in Fen's case, produced an interesting hour with the pack historian, who traced her ungrouped lineage back through 3 generations of traveling healers to a branch of an old Dravenmore bloodline that had separated itself from the pack records in my grandfather's time and simply walked away into the Southern Territories, and was never properly re-registered. She was technically and provably Dravenmore blood. She had been the entire time, without either of us knowing it, already home. She found that funny, in the quiet, contained way she found things funny. I found it the kind of thing that makes you think about fate with more seriousness than you usually allow yourself. Varen's inquiry concluded 3 weeks into the proceedings. He had, it emerged, been running the campaign against Fen for 7 months, since the moment his daughter Setha had mentioned, at dinner, that the Alpha King's wolf had been seen sitting outside the East Wing door. He had understood the implication before I admitted it to myself, which was either to his credit or to the discredit of my own self-awareness, and I was prepared to accept the latter. He had bribed the apothecary clerk to hand over the records briefly, altered them in his own study by lamplight, and submitted them with the calm confidence of a man who expected to be believed. He had expected to be believed because he had been the one at this council table the longest, and people who have been in a room the longest often mistake the length of their tenure for the reliability of their judgment. He lost his council seat. He retained his pack membership. I was not interested in cruelty, only in accuracy, and retired to his estate in the Eastern Valleys to live out his remaining years under the quiet but total social consequence that a pack exercises toward a lord who was caught forging evidence against the Alpha King's mate. That consequence is thorough and self-administering. I had no need to add to it. His daughter Setha came to me privately the week after the inquiry closed and said, with a dignity that I thought well of her for, that she was sorry for the trouble caused in her name and that she had not known the degree to which her father had acted. I believed her. I told her so. She had nothing to be ashamed of, and I told her that too. She thanked me and left, and made a marriage the following season to a pack lord in the north who seemed to be a genuinely decent person, which was the best possible outcome. The Luna ceremony was held on the last evening of the cold month, when the frost was still in the ground, but the edge had gone from the wind, and the herb garden was showing the first pale shoots of the new season. Fen had asked me the week before if we could hold part of it outside. Not the formal portion, she understood the formal portion. She had learned the charter quickly and without complaint, and had a gift for absorbing procedural information that I suspected had served her well in her traveling years. But afterward she had asked, outside. We did. The court came into the courtyard after the hall ceremony. The lords and their wives and the pack seniors and the kitchen staff and the infirmary workers and the young wolves who had been tended through the lung fever 11 months ago. And the courtyard that was usually for crates and linen aired was lit with lanterns set along the garden wall. And Fen stood beside me in a dress that was still simple but new, pale gray, with her herbalist's hands and her quiet face and my cloak over her shoulders. My wolf sat at her feet. It had been there for the entire ceremony, through the formal hall portion and the charter acknowledgement and the pack lord's bows, sitting with its chin up and its amber eyes steady. In the way of a creature that has finally arrived somewhere, it was always going to arrive and sees no reason to be surprised about it. Fen looked at it and then at me, and she said, low enough that only I could hear, "How long do you think he knew?" "From the first morning you opened your door," I said. She thought about that. That was 11 months ago. "He is more patient than I am," I said. She turned to look at the courtyard, the lanterns and the pack gathered, and the herb garden wall with its pale new shoots beginning, and something in her face was the full, unguarded version of the thing she had been keeping quiet and steady for a long time. Not triumph, not vindication, simply the clear and uncomplicated warmth of a woman who has arrived somewhere that turns out to be home. "I had almost packed the travel case," she said. "I know. I kept putting it off. I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I was hoping you'd be slow, not absent." I looked at her. "There is a difference." "Slow means you're still coming," she said, "just taking the long way." I had nothing to say to that, which was a condition I was becoming more comfortable with around her. I put my hand over hers where it rested on the courtyard wall, and the wolf's tail swept across the stones, and the lanterns held their light against the cold, and the pack was around us, and the proceedings were complete, and I was, in every way that mattered, exactly where I was always going to end up. I had only been slow. Fen was not a woman who held that against a man. She was, among the many things she was, capable and quiet and warm-eyed and careful and deeply, unexpectedly funny in the way that only becomes clear when someone trusts you enough to stop suppressing it. The kind of person who looked at a 400-year-old wolf leaning its head against her leg, and a king who had taken 11 months to say what needed saying, and chose to call it the long way home rather than late. I had chosen her. My wolf had known first. Varen had tried to take her from a kingdom that was, it turned out, already hers by blood and by bond and by the particular fact of 11 months of careful work and an herbalist's ledger kept with honest hands. She was my Luna, my mate. The floor of Dravenmore held under her feet and under mine, and the wolf at her feet that had been looking for something for a very long time had found it and was not going to be moved. That, I thought, was the end of the story worth telling. The rest was ours,